Hello, everyone, and welcome to Negotiation in 15 Minutes or Less. I'm Andrew Morgan, and I apologize that I couldn't be there today with you, but I'm currently out with a back injury. And so if the sound is a little weird or anything, I'm currently laying in a bed with my laptop. So I do apologize for any weird sounds that you do hear. You may hear the headphones moving around a little bit. But anyways, let's get started here. So negotiation is defined as a discussion aimed at reaching an agreement between two parties, but in practice, it's an agreement or compromise through discussion, often with both parties giving concessions they would not normally give. You see this oftentimes within negotiation, a kind of a back and forth or anchoring and counter anchoring, as we call it, going back and forth with what you believe would be best for your side, the interests of your party. So, people often think, oh, you just walk in and argue, right? And that's what negotiation is. You see it in the various uh, what are law dramas where people come into court and they just argue, argue, argue. But that's really not what negotiation is. There's a ton of preparation. Planning is 90% of negotiation, and then the actual negotiation is about 10%. So you go through a process of preparation beforehand. You're assessing the situation, what you're negotiating. You're assessing yourself and your readiness for a negotiated agreement. You're assessing your counterparts, whether they're ready for a negotiated agreement, what positions both sides have, what interests both sides have, and you're preparing your positions themselves. And you're trying to put yourself in a frame of mind to actually come to a joint agreement. Now, in some situations, you're not motivated to come to an agreement. We'll get a little bit more to that later. But for what we're doing and the activities we're doing today, we're assuming we actually are trying to reach an agreement. So, assessing the situation. This is assessing what you're negotiating and the negotiation itself. Is it a short term negotiation? Or a long-term negotiation. You care about the relationships there. If it's an ongoing long-term negotiation, like you're negotiating for a job or you're negotiating a long-term contract, you care a lot more about those interactions, those relationships you're building. If you're negotiating short-term, let's say you're buying a car, something like that, you don't care anywhere near as much about that interaction or that long-term relationship. You're buying a thing, and then you're moving on. And the next time you need to buy a thing, it's probably not even the same person. So, are there resources involved that are scarce? Limited ideologies. Think about money and salary. There's a company has X amount of money they're able to give you as a salary. You always want more. They always want to pay less, and there's a middle ground there somewhere. Is this an impasse or an opportunity? Negotiations come out of different things. Sometimes they're business opportunities. Sometimes they're two parties coming to an impasse. Is it a dispute or an exchange? It really has a different framework in the dispute world versus the exchange world. If you're negotiating a contract, or you're in a mediation process that's dispute driven, that exchange is much different than an exchange between two parties trying to reach an agreement for, let's say, a car buying situation. There's different effects on decisions, both yourself personally and whoever's interests you're representing. And I talk a lot about in the class that I teach the BATNA and the WANTNA, the best alternative to a negotiated agreement and the worst alternative to a negotiated agreement. Sometimes these are very easy to see. If you're trying to get a job and you don't get the job, well, that's your worst alternative. Your best alternative could be something else. Could be you're getting the job, but you're not getting what you wanted. And this is very often the case when you're in your first time looking for a job. And one of the activities we're doing today will be talking about that. Is the ratification process for the agreement long or short? Are you talking with the person who can actually ratify the agreement? Are you talking with somebody who, in the case of a car dealership, are you talking to the first level person who really can't help you? Or are you talking to the person who can actually make the deal itself. And then the constraints, cost, time, resources, I think those are pretty straightforward. And then there's assessing you. So this is assessing your goals, your needs. What is, in terms of a negotiated agreement, what is your goals and what are your needs? What are your interests? Also, think about your own personal issues. Do they match with the organization if you're negotiating for an organization? What are the focal points for you personally in the disagreement? What are your target points? What are your positions? You have to know these things before you go into an agreement, or excuse me, before you go into negotiate. And be sure you're representing the organizational goals and not just your own if you're negotiating for an organization. You also want to assess the other side, the other folks who are negotiating. What are their perceived interests and positions? Whenever I go into a negotiation, I'm always thinking, what are they going to say? What are their arguments going to be? Do I have counterpoints for those arguments? What are their motives? What is their best alternative to a negotiated agreement? What is their worst alternative? You have to think about all these things before you go in to negotiate. Are they a negotiation agent, someone who's a professional negotiator? Remember that the act of preparation and planning is as important as the act of negotiating itself. I always like Maslow's quote: if the only tool you have is a hammer, you tend to see every problem as a nail. So you need to move past that and plan. So what do? We need to listen. And I'm not going to go into a ton of the listening based on time, but we have a lot of different kinds of listening. We have coming into a situation with your own ideas. You're not listening to the other person. You're just stating your own ideas. This is not going to result in communication. You have passive listening, and you have listening and evaluating the other person. Should you be listening? These things aren't going to help you very much. What you need to be able to do is actively listen to everything that is said. You need to truly communicate. If you don't understand something, ask questions. Ask questions like, I believe you said this. Is this what you meant? This gives them the ability to gauge whether you've actually heard what they're saying and communicated effectively. So while I know this is silly, it really does show you what happens in some of these situations. One person hears a word, in this case, castronaut, and maybe they're thinking it's an astronaut that's Fidel Castro, when really the person was trying to say castronaut, so it's a cat in space. While I know this is silly, it really does illustrate the point of needing to listen and listen effectively, and be able not just actively listen, but be able to interpret and know what the other person is trying to get across. And what this also brings up is cryptic intent. There's some people who are trying to be very cryptic in their language. While sometimes people have positive intent, sometimes people will be very cryptic with what their needs and interests are, and it makes it very difficult. Remember, when you're negotiating, you need to agree that there's an issue in the first place. You need to agree that you've both come to this particular impasse or this particular opportunity, and you do need to negotiate and find a common ground. And if you haven't figured out what this here means, I love these kind of things, but this is Obi-Wan Kenobi. I know, I'm kind of silly. But anyways, moving on. So the types of negotiators. Now, this isn't really in any book. This is just my own interpretation over the years that I've done this. You'll have kind of four main types. You'll have resignation and capitulation. They're typically soft negotiators, and they'll give up on a lot of points. Now, sometimes they use this as an advantage, and they start real high, and they bring down back to their point that they wanted to get to anyways. You also have attack hardline negotiators. They're hard bargainers. They're attacking on each and every point. They go after every little detail. You'll have a compromise position, which is a mix between attack and resignation. And then you'll have a mixed motive person or position, which is kind of a combination of cooperation and competition. And we really want to try to move to that mixed motive position if we can. So compromise. A compromise is the art of dividing a cake in such a way that everyone believes they have the biggest piece. And I know it's silly to think about compromise and have to define it out, but you really do have to think about how to make the other person in a negotiation believe that they're getting something. And they're going to be doing the same thing to you. So both sides are going to be doing this. So is it best to have a deal today or a deal tomorrow? Think about the relationships in these situations. Like I said in the beginning, what is the type of relationship you're going here? Are you buying a car? Well, you really don't care about tomorrow. But if the relationship matters, you really want to make sure you're conducting yourself in a way that's going to help keep that relationship good. So strategic risk, I won't get into a lot of it, but you want to think about the major risks in your negotiation. So you're going to a car, if you already have a car, you don't need another car, you just want another car, there's really not a lot of risk there. So there's not a lot of force for you to get that car, to make that particular purchase. If you're a year out of college, you're still looking for a job and you haven't been able to find a job, you really have a high risk mindset. You really need to get a job. You're starting to make sacrifices because you need a job, and you're getting to where you care less and less about what that job is. So know your risks and what you need before you get into the negotiation. Also identify the issues before you choose different tactics. You want to identify what the common interests are, what the conflicting interests are, and try to find what the compromises would be. Have those points in your head before you step into a negotiation. And make sure that you have kind of the reasons why you are where you are negotiating together in your head. Table tactics, you want to offer incentives, you want to talk about the costs of the negotiation itself, or think about the costs. If I negotiate for too long, am I going to get what I need? Am I going to get what I want? You're not really going to talk much about support or allies here, but think about anchoring and counter-anchoring. Making offers back and forth, closing. Know when your deal is done, and also write down your terms, even if you're just writing them down on a piece of paper in front of yourself. Make sure you know when the deal has been achieved and what the deal is. So I'm not going to go through all these skills, but take a read here. These are the things you need to be able to do to be an effective negotiator. You need effective verbal communication. Make sure that you've practiced these skills, that you're good at these skills. So what you need to be able to do is when you negotiate is, like I've said, understand the situation, acknowledge the problem, be patient, avoid using coercion and intimidation, focus on the problem in the negotiation, not the individual, establish guidelines, keep communications open, and act decisively when you're negotiating. So everything is about planning. As I keep saying, we have to be able to communicate and we have to be able to plan. The negotiation part of it is kind of small compared to everything else. So what is your best alternative and your worst alternative to your negotiated agreement? What are your tactics? What are your strategies? Know what your product or service is. Know what you're specifically looking for. Know your interests going into the negotiation. So you need to fix your approach sometimes too. So let's say there's an actual value of $400. Instead of saying my offer is $90, this creates an emotional reaction. Say, would you possibly take $90? This kind of softening statement can really help avoid the emotional rejection or emotional action that someone will hear when they get a kind of low offer. And also think about your body language. If you have your arms crossed and closed, you don't look like you're ready to make an agreement. So we're about 15 minutes here, so I just want to thank you. The facilitators are now going to hand out some prompts. You're going to negotiate. This is the fun part. You're going to read some things. You're going to do quick planning just because we have time constraints. But if you have any questions, feel free to email me. My email is here on the page, andrewlmorgan@ucsb.edu. And I also teach negotiation at various places, including Extension here on campus. Thank you, and have some fun negotiating.